Do you ever feel like you are on the outside looking in? If so, I have good news for you this morning from the gospel. I also want to reclaim a gospel passage that has given me so much trouble before. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit more about God's love for those who are on the outside looking in. I take it for granted this morning that deep down we all believe the love of God is for all people. I know we might struggle or disagree about just exactly how we express that conviction, but I grew up in Sunday school with some of you singing, "Red and yellow, black and white, all are precious in His sight." And I find it to be true that whenever I talk to someone about God's love for others, they embrace the message of love for God and love for neighbor. Why is it that we have so much trouble agreeing on how we express that love? If I'm being honest with you, I have the hardest time accepting people completely. To accept someone, does that mean I have to accept all their beliefs and ideals? Do I have to agree with the way they think about this or that on this issue? Do I have to fly the same flag or post the same sign in my yard? I don't know about you, but I seem to have friends on both sides of most social issues. From time to time, even with people that I love very much or am close to, I feel like someone on the outside looking in, or think they feel the same way. I feel in my heart like we are as divided as was the divided kingdom of Israel when it split between the north and south. And I know I'm part of a history of a country that has been split between black and white, right and left in so many ways that I fear sometimes even the church we love is divided between us and them, and often leaving outsiders looking in. Then again, there are histories and divisions far outside those that we are even aware of that have split our world since long before we can remember. And the gospel passage this morning speaks directly to just such a division when it speaks to us about the Canaanite woman who approached Jesus in Tyre and Sidon. We are probably too removed from that particular history to feel the tension between a Canaanite woman and an Israelite man. But these are two people who are in an us and them scenario, who were born to be on opposite sides of just about every dividing line in their world. Now, first I have to admit that once upon a time I read Matthew 15 and wanted to throw my Bible up against the wall. I read how this Canaanite woman, this poor woman, pleaded with Jesus for mercy because her daughter was suffering terribly. And I read how Jesus did not answer a word. I read how a second time she asked and pleaded with God for mercy, and He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." I read how she came and knelt before Him and pleaded, "Lord, help me." And He replied, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." With passages like these in the Bible, I do not wonder why some people look at Christianity as part of the problem in this world. Why some people look at passages like these and think Jesus was a bigot or a racist. But today I want to tell you the story of how God has given me back this passage. How God has allowed me to see this same Jesus in a totally different light by reading this passage in Matthew 15 in the greater context of the Spirit. Context, it turns out, is super important when interpreting Scripture. If I were to ask you what color is square A or what color is square B, you might tell me just at a glance that they are opposite colors, that one is black and one is white in this particular checkerboard scheme. However, with just a simple reveal, you can see that they are the same color, and that in fact context greatly influences our perceptions in this world. Notice how context might also lead you to interpret this photograph. Do you know this man? Well, in the context of church, you might rightly assume it was Jesus. But with a little bit different point of view, you'll see it's not Jesus at all. A completely different picture of Jesus emerges when we read this passage in the context of the whole of Matthew's Gospel, particularly when we look at the end, what comes at the end of this passage. That Jesus says to her, to this woman, "Woman, you have great faith." Almost exactly the opposite of what Jesus has just said to Peter when He said, "You of little faith." Furthermore, Matthew is dropping some important clues when he tells us all of this takes place in the region of Tyre and Sidon. In other words, in the outskirts of Israel, and more like in the Gentile world. And when he draws our attention to the fact that this is a Canaanite woman. If we compare the Gospel of Mark to the Gospel of Matthew on this theme, we find the same story told in two remarkably different ways. Matthew decides to call her a Canaanite woman, where Mark simply called her a Greek one. Canaanite being a much older, almost archaic term that nobody used in Matthew's time to refer to the ancient tensions between the Israelites and the Canaanites in the Bible, to refer to the ultimate Old Testament us versus them. Matthew emphasizes this woman's persistence, that 3 times she pleads out to the Son of David for mercy, as if Matthew wants to emphasize her persistence in asking and prayer. And as we continue to explore the context of this passage in Matthew, we see that faith, the woman's faith, is exactly what Jesus and Matthew are emphasizing here. In the passage that comes right before this one, Peter asks Jesus to explain the parable, and his dullness, so to speak, contrasts the woman's brilliance that is just about to come. He doesn't understand what Jesus is teaching, that whatever enters the mouth and goes into the stomach and then out of the body is not the kind of thing that is able to defile a person, but only that which comes out of a person's mouth. In other words, their actions, their words, their choices, that which comes from the heart, the rational mind, the center of our being. These choices are what defile a person. And by defile, it's clear that Jesus doesn't mean simply something physical. He's referring to being in or being out with God, being holy or unholy. That which makes one in with God is a matter of words and choices and actions, not a matter of what you eat or don't eat, or where you come from, or what blood runs in your veins. So yes, while it's true out of context, one could read Jesus' words as very bigoted or even racist here. It's clear that in the context, Matthew is trying to say something very different about God's love and compassion, even for those on the other side of the dividing lines in their world. After all, Matthew himself, we read, was a tax collector, meaning that he himself was someone on the outside of Jewish society looking in. So what can we say about these strange words of Jesus in Matthew 15 to the woman? First, I think we can say for sure that Jesus is fiercely loyal to Israel for God's sake, and for the sake of the particular mission that the Father has sent him to Israel to complete. But I think we can also say with confidence that God's scandalous purpose in Jesus has always been to include the Gentiles in salvation by faith, to bring them acceptance, to bring them adoption into every aspect of God's family, to bring holiness to all who will believe and to all who will persist in that faith. I would also insist that Jesus never had any intention of rejecting or making fun of that woman whom God had decided from the beginnings, the foundation of the world, to uphold and exalt as an example of faith for all believers to this very day. I believe Jesus only seems to hesitate in his encounter with this woman to prove what he already knows is in her heart, the faith that can be an example for all of us as Christians, for all of us who sometimes are on the outside looking in. And one of the reasons I feel so confident is in saying this is that I read this gospel passage in the context of the Bible as a whole, in the context also of Paul's message to the Romans, that God's intentions in history are to be merciful to all. Paul tells those who are in the church not to think too highly of themselves because they are believers, but to consider that God's love is also for those who have not yet come to believe. And Paul calls those who are children of Israel not to think too highly of themselves as Israelites, but to consider God's love for the Gentile whom he is calling to himself. Nevertheless, Paul doesn't hesitate to stand with the believers in history, to stand with those who stand for Christ and trust him to the end. I mean, yeah, on the one hand, it's hard, it's difficult. There are so many choices crying out for our attention, so many stances we're being asked to take. And every choice we make, everything we accept implies another rejection. And yes, on the one hand, we need to be extremely thoughtful and careful about our choices in these days. Is there any chance we're making this too hard on ourselves? Harder than it has to be? Is there any chance that what it means to be a disciple of Jesus is quite simple after all? Is it possible that the only question we really need to focus on answering this morning is whether or not we intend to follow him and follow him in all things? I believe that as long as following Jesus is just one of the things on our schedule, amidst many other concerns or distracting desires that we have, that we will always only partially love one another and have this frustrating experience that we are only able to partially accept and partially reject one another. Today, together with you, I want to move past just righteous anger or pity. Pity for the Syrian woman who seems to be left out in the gospel passage. Because as we look closely, we see that she's not left out at all. She is someone who is in with God, who has faith in Jesus persistently. And she is one who stands at the door, knocking, praying, opening for us to come in. To a certain extent, we are all the Canaanite woman, knocking on heaven's door this morning, looking in on the love between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and I trust wanting nothing more than to know that love in our hearts and in our lives, to be so filled and saturated with the love of God that we have more than enough to share with others an open door to adoption, to salvation, to sanctification by faith. Let none of us this morning assume that we're all good, we're on the inside, but let us knock and seek and ask as fiercely as she did this morning and persist in our faith, and today make the choice for Christ and him only, and not stop knocking until that kingdom comes.